This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. As a growing number of observers characterize Brexit negotiations between the UK and EU as being on the verge of collapse, it seems pop songwriter Neil Sedaka had it right. Breaking up is hard to do. We'll look today at the state of negotiations, what the issues are, and what might happen if things fall apart. An historian by training, today's guest is also a keen observer of current events in the UK and Ireland. Timothy McMahon is Associate Professor of History at Marquette University, where his research and teaching focus on national identity, imperialism, and popular culture in that part of the world. Tim, welcome back to International Focus.
Thanks, Doug.
Well, I'd like to start, if I could, with a quote by a British financial writer, David Osler, who had a rather snarky tweet recently with regard to sort of the overall enterprise of Brexit. He says, quote, "I'm going to cancel Netflix and negotiate with each film producer separately to get the best deal for me and my family." So is that what at the end of the day Brexit is turning out to be?
It is potentially so. Yes. I mean, once the UK actually divorces itself from the EU, as it's supposed to do within the next 2 years, essentially they'll have to renegotiate trade agreements with countries all over the world. We're looking at probably somewhere north of 180 different agreements. And so that's going to create more entanglement than I think any country's ever had to go through in very short order. Of course, that's all predicated on the negotiations with the EU actually coming to a reasonable conclusion from the British perspective.
So talk a little bit about that timeline. Now, we hear a lot about Article 50 and what was that and what happened?
Right. Well, part of the agreement when you join the EU and the treaty that set up the European Union actually did have the proviso that one could exit. But there was a discrete timeline attached to that of a 2-year period. So once Article 50 was formally invoked, as it was earlier this year.
So Theresa May, as Prime Minister, says, okay, I'm invoking Article 50, and the clock starts.
The clock ticks. And so we're looking at essentially March of 2019 being the deadline.
So there are really phases in that negotiation as well, are there not? I mean, the Brits would very much like to jump right to the bread and butter issues of trade arrangements. Are they still in that trade union, or, are they out? But the EU says, wait a minute, we've got to get the terms of the divorce before we can start talking about what happens afterwards. Right. And that's really where we are now.
Right. I mean, essentially, there are 3 key issues on the front end of this that both parties are interested in. One is Britain paying for commitments that they already have to the EU up through 2019. One is what the situation will be for EU citizens who are resident in the United Kingdom and United Kingdom citizens who are resident in the other 27 countries of the EU. And so that's issue number 2. And then issue number 3 is the land border between the European Union and the United Kingdom. This would be the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Surprisingly, the one significant land border that the UK has with the European Union, and a subject that really wasn't even talked about during the Brexit debates and election. But it's front and center right now.
So remind us again, when did Article 50 come into effect, and how long have the negotiations been going on?
Okay, they've been going on since March, since late in the spring. After Prime Minister May formally said that they were going to go forward, there had to be an act of parliament, and that took place in March. So that's when the clock actually started ticking. So we're now looking at a 2-year window. We're now several months into that, and the negotiations began in the late spring and over the summer. And there are a lot of players involved here. Not only are we looking at the EU Commission, but individual countries can also be negotiating. What's interesting is Theresa May has indicated, in fact, just this week when she was at the United Nations meeting in New York, she indicated that that the real negotiations would take place between the heads of state. But the fact of the matter is that the civil servants and members of cabinet who are responsible for finance and for foreign relations are heavy in the negotiations at this point in time.
And not to rave reviews, by all accounts.
Well, in the case of the United Kingdom, the Parliament can't even, excuse me, the Cabinet can't even speak with one voice. We need to remember a couple of things about the current Cabinet. You know, after Article 50 was invoked, Theresa May also called a general election. And she anticipated, based on earlier polls, that her party would gain significant numbers of seats, when in fact they lost seats. And now her party is actually in a bit of a coalition arrangement. In order to achieve the number of seats that she needed to govern, she's dependent not only on conservatives in England and Wales, but conservatives in Scotland, who almost act as a separate party, and the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, which is a completely separate party. And 10 of the votes that are part of the 320 plus that she needs to maintain her majority are actually Democratic Unionist votes. So you actually have, in effect, 3 parties within the one coalition. And on top of that, even within the party, the Conservative Party from within England and Wales, they don't have a unified vision in terms of the relationship to Europe. And so that's created some rivalries within the cabinet, in particular between the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and people like the Chancellor of the Exchequer and also the Home Secretary.
So the PM calls early elections thinking the result will be a more monolithic government to go into the negotiations, and it turned out to be more fractious than it was before.
It absolutely was more fractious, and you know, she kept talking about how it would make for a strong and stable situation, when in fact during the campaign itself and then subsequent to the campaign, she really hasn't appeared like a strong and stable leader. Or certainly, if she were appearing as a strong leader, she doesn't appear to be a strong leader on top of a stable cabinet. And so, for example, the Foreign Secretary was one of the leading voices in the Leave campaign when the Brexit referendum came up. Boris Johnson was very vocal in his attitudes toward Brexit, and it was speaking really as an English nationalist would be speaking. This is between us and them. What you see in other members of the cabinet, in particular the Chancellor Philip Hammond and the Home Secretary Amber Rudd, you're seeing people who are more concerned in particular with business relationships with the European Union, and they would like to find a softer Brexit than perhaps Mr. Johnson would.
So those are probably terms we should talk a little bit about. You hear, of course, on the far ends, there's the Remain camp who says Brexit shouldn't happen, and then obviously the Brexit folks. But within Brexit, what do people mean by hard and soft?
Okay. A hard Brexit would imply not only the sense of full sovereignty over all regulations and law being United Kingdom controlled, so no longer being regulated from Brussels, but it also would imply pulling out of the single market, the European market, Of course, the pound, the British were never a part of the single currency, but they are members of the single market, which allows for free trade to other EU countries and also freedom of movement of people from the other 27 countries into Britain and Britain to those other 27 countries. In essence, this is why that second element I brought up before, people. In the early stages of the negotiations, what will it actually mean for people who are resident within Britain from the other EU countries, or from the EU countries, excuse me, and what will it mean for British citizens who are resident in those EU countries? I mean, imagine, just for a hardline Brexiteer, somebody who wants the full break, what are the implications for a British citizen who might have retired and moved to a warmer climate, like perhaps in Spain? Is that person supposed to move back to the United Kingdom? Will they have full rights in Spain as expat Brits? These are questions that really weren't dealt with in the campaign. The rhetoric of the hardline nationalists was essentially that this would be a fairly simple, straightforward affair. And those who are more interested in the soft Brexit kept saying, this is going to be a lot more complex than you're suggesting. So the question you asked me earlier about negotiating all those individual trade agreements, people, especially in the City of London, the financial sector, raised concerns and questions about the implications of Brexit. And they have been trying to, especially to put the brakes on with the vote. A really insightful column was done by an Irish writer by the name of Fintan O'Toole recently, and he was highlighting the concept that what we think of as the United Kingdom is in many ways 5 different units. You've got the City of London is one unit. You've got the area outside of London that is still in England, then Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Of those, 3 of the 5 actually voted to remain in the EU in that Brexit referendum, the City, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But overall, when you added it up, England beyond London and Wales voted to leave.
So what are some of the other sort of splits or camps within the UK then? Is there a geographical element to this? I mean, North versus South, or, England versus, I mean, you referenced this a bit, but.
This is something that I think is really an extraordinary moment for people who study, national identity like I do. Within the United Kingdom, you have this sense that there is a British identity, at least within England, Wales, and Scotland. Certainly that was talked about as if there were a single British identity from the late 19th century right up into the late 20th century. But in fact, as we're seeing, for example, in Scotland, where you've had calls for greater independence, but even in Wales, where in the late 90s they established a Welsh assembly, the sense of distinct identity certainly exists. Even in England, though, where scholars often talk about a difference between North and South, one of the things that was surprising to some of us, myself included, about the Leave vote was that outside of London, North and South were actually united. There was sort of an English identity that united rural areas with urban areas and saying there has to be something distinctive about us and we want control again over our affairs. And that frankly carried the day in that vote.
So if a hard Brexit then is pretty much very little connection with Brussels after the fact, what are some of the gradations leading up to that? I mean, what do soft Brexiteers hope for?
Well, let's see. Some of the things that soft Brexiteers, I think, would prefer would include fairly easy arrangements for tourism, for example, so that you would still have relatively free movement to and from the EU from the UK and vice versa. You certainly would, the purest soft Brexiteers are going to want to remain associated with the single market. perhaps not having freedom of movement of people as easily, but freedom of movement of goods and money. And
because, of course, the financial sector is huge.
It is huge, yes, absolutely. If you think about it, just in metropolitan London, there are something like 5,500 concerns, financial concerns, that have relationships, exchange relationships with other countries throughout the EU. And if the hardest Brexit happened, if, for example, they cannot work out a deal, those businesses are going to lose what are known as passport rights. In order to stay in business, let's say you're based in London, in order to stay in business in Germany, you would have to set up a subsidiary in Germany, or you couldn't have the free relationship. The implication of that, of course, is that some of those 5,500 businesses might actually pull up from London and move to an EU country so that they would still have access to the single market.
So we've talked a lot about sort of the sensibilities on the UK side. What about on the EU side? I mean, it sounds like a soft Brexit would really favor business interests, certainly within the UK. What would be in it for the EU?
Well, I think for the EU, among other things, you're going to have a good, the financial implications would be quite positive, I think, also for the EU. But the other thing that the EU is very cognizant of, and I think they've been especially strong on this point, is that one of the 27 countries in the European Union is, in fact, the Republic of Ireland. And the Republic of Ireland is that place that has the land border with the United Kingdom. And they also have a distinct relationship with the part of the United Kingdom that's known as Northern Ireland. Because of bilateral agreements that the Republic of Ireland and the UK had, you actually have what amounts to a soft border now. You don't have to go through customs checkpoints. You don't have to go through, as a tourist, for example, even to show your passport as you cross the border. And you would lose that in a hard Brexit situation. And so for the hard Brexiteers to have acted as if there wasn't a border to worry about indicates that they hadn't really thought through the entirety of what they were calling for. The financial implications for the Irish, North and South, are pretty dire if a hard Brexit were to come. And so the EU, recognizing that, is negotiating from a very strong, a strong position in favor of maintaining that soft border.
And given the history of the North and the Republic, the idea that somehow there'd be a carve-out that would imply there's the UK and then there's a special status for Northern Ireland is problematic for the Unionists in Northern Ireland, is it not? I mean, the idea that somehow you'd be moving down a road that says you're actually more connected to the EU and by implication to the Republic of Ireland than the rest of the UK.
It is. You know, this is where we get into, I mean, some of the most complex issues of identity, but also, you know, hard money. Imagine that you're a farmer in Northern Ireland, and one of the things that you've benefited from since 1973 are subsidies from the European Union, or the EEC before the European Union existed. You know, you're going to lose those in a hard Brexit situation. The UK government actually has had a very interesting answer to that, a suggestion just a few weeks ago that they made because of a bilateral agreement that was made with the Republic of Ireland in the late 1990s. People who are born in Northern Ireland could claim both British and Irish citizenship. And so the government said, well, of course, they could you know, get an Irish passport, and then as EU citizens, they could get
they'd become Irish farmers.
Exactly, for just for the purposes of the subsidies. I don't think that's going to happen in the negotiations. But you know, it was very interesting that you know, in the case of Northern Ireland, the largest of the unionist parties, the Democratic Unionists, who are part of Ms. May's coalition, they were the one party that was outright against or in favor of leaving. And in fact, one of their MPs was just here in Milwaukee recently for Irish Fest. And he was talking about Brexit at that time, and he was saying that in his constituency, overwhelmingly the people who voted for him wanted to leave. And this is a man who won his constituency with more than 60% of his of the electors. So you know, they do feel as if they are in the right in helping Mrs. May with this with the negotiations. At the same time, they also recognize the financial benefits of that soft border on the island of Ireland, and so they're trying to, you know, square a circle, and it's incredibly complex.
Well, Theresa May famously said at one point that no deal is better than a bad deal. So let's talk a little bit about that. What would no deal look like? What if the deadline comes and goes, negotiations have been stymied, and the clock has just struck the final hour, and that's that? What does that look like?
That could look really ugly financially for the United Kingdom. If there is no deal worked out, the trade situation would basically fall back on World Trade Organization terms. And while the WTO in general favors free trade, it doesn't favor free trade in all instances. So, for example, British farmers could be subject to tariffs trading with EU countries, and those tariffs could go as high as 30 or 40%. If you look at that issue of passporting rights that I was talking about before, the prospect of businesses literally pulling up stakes and leaving Britain to take up new homes in Dublin or in Paris or in Frankfurt, that could be quite extraordinary. And if you just look at the financial sector, in the first quarter of 2016, when Britain's trade surplus with the EU was about 25 billion pounds, that same quarter, 45% of that surplus was in the financial sector. So if they leave or if they are damaged because of no deal, that'll have profound implications for the British. I mean, the British Treasury, for example, has estimated that something on the order of 800,000 people would be unemployed. More people would be unemployed if this worst-case scenario came forward, and that the pound sterling's value could actually decline by as much as 15%. So these are significant concerns.
So beyond sort of the proximate issues dealing with Brexit, whenever there's a tumult like this, there's opportunity for canny politicians. How is this playing out within British politics? Are there people who think this is an opportunity? I mean, Theresa May does not look like the strongest PM. Is she vulnerable now?
She is potentially vulnerable right now, and this is where, again, the name Boris Johnson rises.
Talk a little bit about just his biography. It's kind of interesting.
Well, he's very interesting. Of course, he's worked as a journalist before. Interestingly enough, with regard to the relationship between Britain and the EU, he actually worked as a correspondent in Brussels. So, you know, early in his career, he watched the EU up close. Of course, most Americans came to know him when he was Lord Mayor of London. And after David Cameron essentially lost the Brexit referendum and stepped down as Prime Minister, there were many people who speculated that Johnson would, in fact, emerge as the new Prime Minister. That didn't happen, and in fact, he pulled himself out of the running as Theresa May's star rose. But then he found himself in one of these prime positions, right, as Foreign Secretary. He is and has been throughout his career somebody who is bombastic. He does not always think before he speaks, but he's colorful. And there is this sense in which he has a charisma about him. And certainly playing to the sort of the nationalist drumbeat in the run-up to Brexit didn't hurt that either elements of that reputation. Just about a little over a week ago, he published an essay, a long essay in the Telegraph, in which he basically put out the hard Brexit position, which was not, as I said, in keeping with other members of the cabinet. And so this week at the UN, he made sure to spend time alone with the Prime Minister. And when they were asked about what was going on afterward, he was quoted as saying, and I love this, I'm going to look at my notes just to make sure I get this right, "No, we're a government working together. We're a nest of singing birds," right?
Well, on that happy note, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it and advise our viewers to stay tuned on this one.
Yep.
Tim McMahon, thank you as always.
Thank you.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.